All right, good morning, everyone. It's my honor to introduce Professor Thora Tenbrink as our keynote speaker for ALTA. Thora is Professor of Linguistics at Bangor University, Wales, UK, and she uses linguistic analysis to understand how people think. She's the author of Cognitive Discourse Analysis and Introduction by Cambridge University Press, in Space-Time and the Use of Language by Moulton de Gruyter, and co-edited various further books on spatial language, representation, and dialogue, and published more than 40 peer-reviewed journal papers. And I have to add that she also enjoys organizing hybrid conferences with many time changes. So next time, maybe we can invite Thora to organize it. Thank you, Thora. Let's welcome her.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very kind of you to invite me to this conference. I'm very sorry that I can't attend in person. It would be nice to be there in the summer. It's winter where I am. So I'm going to talk about spatial reference. So how do we refer to spatial relationships, particularly when we talk to automatic systems, but I will do a few detours, mostly talking about how humans talk about spatial relationships before I get back to the idea of smart environments. So bear with me. I have a point to make, but I can only make it if I go through a number of things that are relevant for humans. So if we want to talk freely about our thoughts, we would like to just look into somebody else's head and just find out what they are thinking by looking through the keyhole. Unfortunately, this is not very easy to do. So we use language to understand what people are thinking, and we assume that spatial language represents spatial thinking to some extent. There's a match between language and thinking, but it's quite complicated to find out how exactly that works. It is even more complicated when you are talking not to a human, but to an automatic system, because what's going on inside a machine can be quite different to what's going on inside a person's head. So that's sort of where we start from. We have to sort of match the way humans think with the way systems think or operate. So just to give you a short preview of what I'm going to be talking about, I will start by just thinking about spatial reference, the way how it is ubiquitous and challenging. For instance, it's challenging to agree about orientation in dialogue. It's challenging to identify a perspective in a context like sailing. It's challenging to find a reference frame when oriented in a different way. And it's challenging to agree on a reference frame between languages. So lots of different challenges coming out of different studies that we have done. And then I'll come to the topic of smart environments with their various features and the challenges that are associated with that. And at the end of my talk, I will present a possible solution for these challenges, and hopefully we can have a discussion about that. So spatial language and cognition. Spatial language is fundamental. Space is fundamental because space is a basic human conceptual domain like time. Or even more basic, because we operate in space and spatial surroundings. Basically, everything we do happens in the location at a particular time. We move from place to place. We can connect virtually as we do now, but even so, we are also located in a particular place. So how we understand space affects our life and thinking, and it also reflects our life and thinking. So the space has a lot to do with how we live, and I'm sure Barbara Tversky will talk a lot more about that aspect of space and how important it is. Language reflects this importance of space and the way humans think about space. For instance, how spatial terms express our everyday experience. And I will give you an example of that in a minute. Space is also ubiquitous, so everyday language contains quite a lot of information about spatial positions, you know, how to get to this conference, how to find the room, where your hotel is, or whatever. So we talk about where things are, how to get there, or if you've forgotten your glasses, you might want to find out where they are relative to your current position, and things like that. It just happens all the time. So that's one aspect, but we also talk about space when we don't really talk about space. For instance, we say things like Christmas is around the corner, which is a temporal thing, not a spatial thing, but we use spatial language for temporal aspects as well, and various other domains besides time. So spatial language is all over the place, and we can't really communicate without it. So first challenge I wanted to talk about is agreeing about orientation in dialogue. So this comes out of a study on object orientation in dialogue, where we looked at spatial inference processes. So the idea behind that is whenever we talk to somebody else or interact with a communication partner, there's always something that isn't explicit in language. So there's always something that we need to infer. It's a feature of communication in general, and it can be studied in spatial language in particular. For one thing, because it's so fundamental and ubiquitous, but for another, because we can compare what people say with the scene that they currently are looking at. So it's a very nice domain for looking at how much of a current scene people actually put into words and how they do that. So the scenario that we choose is one of a moving house. So if you move house, you will have to put your furniture in various places, and because you can't do it all by yourself, you ask some friends to help you and explain to them where all these different furniture items go. So put that shelf into that room, at the wall to the left, and you know, lots of spatial language comes into play. So how do we explain where things go? So there are various different kinds of spatial reference. One aspect to consider is that there's quite a lot of evidence for effects of functional relationships. So for example, if you look at that picture here, there's a man and an umbrella, and the sun is shining, and we can ask whether the man actually sits under the umbrella. If you think about it really spatially, you could argue, well, he sits half under the umbrella, perhaps on the edges. But if you think of the sun and the man wanting to sit in the shade, then definitely yes, he sits under the umbrella, because the umbrella has at this moment the function of protecting him from the sun. And that kind of functional relationship is quite frequent in spatial language use. Another complication for spatial reference is that projective terms like in front of or to the right of require a perspective. So something is to the right from my point of view or from your point of view, and that can be quite different. So all of these things happen in spatial reference, and they might complicate things when we want to explain to our friends where the various furniture items go. A few years ago, I came up with a schematic model of explaining how we understand projective terms. We use underlying reference frames, which have been explained quite nicely by Stephen Levinson in 1996, and various other authors have done the same or different approaches to explaining reference frames. So this model that I've designed is built on Levinson's framework, who distinguishes between intrinsic, relative, and absolute reference frames. For an intrinsic reference frame, you basically describe the position of an object relative to another object or person, which would be called relatum, and use the relatum's intrinsic features for perspective. So for instance, if I am the relatum, I could say the table or the computer at the moment is in front of me. And that is based on my own perspective at this moment. So the locatum in this picture, it is the lock, the square, The locatum is the item that I'm describing, namely the table or the computer, and it is in front of me from my perspective using my line of vision. And if I then bring in motion, a motion direction, then I could say I am moving forward from my point of view, using my perspective forward towards the computer, for instance. In a relative reference frame, you need a third location. So in an intrinsic, you only have the relatum with the perspective and the locatum, which is located relative to the relatum. Whereas in a relative reference frame, the perspective is associated with a third entity. So you could say the computer is to the right of a book on my table in front of me, for instance. So I could say to the right of the book from my perspective. So I'm then represented by the triangle here. So I would be the origin. And from my perspective, the computer is to the right of the book. So these are the two basic different reference frames. And there are lots of complications associated with those. There are more variations that can be used. And I could spend the rest of the 45 minutes just talking about that, but I won't. So for location, reference frames have been explained in quite a lot of detail. After decades of arguing about it, people are now relatively clear about what happens there. However, with object orientation, it's not quite as well researched, really. So we don't know much about how people actually refer to how objects are oriented. And there are a few different ways in which people can refer to that. So for instance, one could say the sofa's back is along the left wall, or the chair is oriented towards the table, in which case the orientation information is established by reference again to a relatum, namely the left wall in the first example and the table in the second. Another option is to use a projective term like left and right. The chair points to the right. And as we've just seen with location information for spatial reference frames, we need a perspective to interpret projective terms. So if you say the chair points to the right, there must be an underlying perspective. And in this particular utterance, it is underspecified. So it doesn't say the chair points to the right from my point of view or from the chair's point of view or whatever. So that's something that needs to be inferred from the context. And that goes back to what I said earlier about in communication, we don't always say everything explicitly. We take a lot of things for granted and that need to be inferred in dialogue. Another option is to say the chair's back points north. So that's the third, using the third reference frame, which I haven't yet explained, which basically uses compass directions or cardinal directions, which is called an absolute reference frame, where we just use words like north, south, east, and west, or something similar that is based, that is sort of always there in the scenario. In this case, the orientation can be given using cardinal directions, and that's unambiguous and not underspecified. We can complicate things with orientation, for instance, by coming up with a scenario where somebody moves backwards, for instance, sitting backwards on a horse. And we could say this is defined relative to the rider's intrinsic features, because the horse is moving forwards relative to their own intrinsic features. So they're following their nose, but the rider is actually going backwards because the movement is not where the person is looking, but actually they're not even looking in either direction. They're looking to the left, and that's again defined relative to the rider's intrinsic features. So somebody is here going backwards, moving backwards, but looking, or being oriented to yet another direction. So things can be quite interesting when combining movement directions with orientation. So given this complexity of spatial location and orientation information, how explicit are we actually in dialogue, and what does this depend on? That's what we asked in our study. And the second question is, how much information do we need? Under what circumstances does communication fail? So we built up a corpus where people used a lot of spatial language. So basically the task was to furnish a dollhouse. So not a real house, one moving house. That would have been a bit too complicated for us, but we used the dollhouse. Actually, two dollhouses, two models. One person had a pre-furnished house with lots of furniture in it, and their task was to explain just where the furniture needed to go to the other person, who was sitting opposite of them, separated by the wall, so they couldn't see the pre-furnished house. They had an empty house in front of them. The furniture was all piled up on the left, and this person, called the matcher or addressee, had to put the furniture in the right place. So we collected lots of dialogue with lots of spatial language and annotated that in various ways. So here we are looking at orientation information. So we looked at the utterances and tried to find out whether they were complete or not. So we define completeness by saying an utterance is complete if there is an explicit reference to one of the axes of the item that is to be placed, and the axis directedness, if applicable, and a fully specified direction. Incomplete if one of the required parameters was missing, for instance, the underlying perspective for a projective term. Also, the orientation of diagonally placed objects was considered as completely described only when diagonality was made explicit. So here are a few examples. Also a glimpse at how it looks when we annotate dialogue in Excel. So this is just a snapshot from an Excel file, where we see on the left the conditions. We had two different conditions. In one condition, the furniture was placed sort of in a normal way. We called that the functional condition. So for instance, all the bathroom items were in one room, and they were placed in such a way that they would function in the real world. And the other condition was non-functional, so NF in this table. And that meant that the furniture was placed more or less randomly. And we wanted to see whether that has any influence on whether or not the utterances were complete with respect to orientation information. So if you look at the first utterance, the orientation description, the toilet is parallel to the shower, practically placed at the back wall. So the latence axes are undirected, so we don't know in which way it can be parallel to the shower. It's not defined. In that sense, it's incomplete. The next utterance is complete. The opening points towards the bed. The next one, yes, well, diagonally opposite the wardrobe, so beside the armchair there in the corner, is again incomplete because the locatance axes are not described, and so on. So it's quite a challenge to define, to be clear about what aspects of each utterance are missing. It takes really considering what the kinds of things are that are immediately automatically understood or not, or can be misunderstood because they are not said explicitly. So that was quite a feat, annotating it all. So here we have an example. So we collected the data in German, so apologies. I tried to translate that. So we have speaker A saying, and now we have this colorful cupboard. And where does speaker B is asking a clarification question, and where does the colorful side point? And speaker A then says it points into the bedroom. So we have here a reference to one of the object's directed axis, namely, where does the colorful side point? And then we get the direction and the relatum, namely the bedroom, fully specified by speaker A. And this is achieved collaboratively because of the clarification question as to where the directed axis is actually pointing. Here's another example where the orientation information is incomplete and leads to misinformation or miscommunication. So put the shower on the middle wall was the instruction. And the participants' result, as you can see on the left side, does not correspond to the model position. So something wasn't quite clear about how exactly the object should be oriented within the space specified. Okay, so we have seen an example of actual miscommunication. What you see here is basically the quantitative results from the study, from the entire corpus. So we have these various categories, functional condition, non-functional conditions, so F and NF in each of these columns. And we can see in the colors that only a very, very small percentage across the board, independent of condition, actually failed. Most of the instances were successful, and that's independent of whether it was the functional or the non-functional condition. And it's also pretty much independent on whether the information given was complete, incomplete, or even entirely missing. So we can see some tendencies here. So in the functional condition, we don't have as many complete utterances as in the non-functional condition. And in the non-functional condition, we don't really have many missing instances of orientation information. That's the one on the right. In the functional condition, almost half of the furniture items were placed without any orientation information at all. But that didn't mean that people placed the objects wrongly, because the failed instances, or the number of failed instances, was very small across the board. That's the red bit on the bottom. So relevant answers here for our questions. How explicit are we in dialogue, and what does this depend on? So the answer, the global answer we get to that based on our study, is that speakers are only explicit when they feel they need to be. So they feel the need to be explicit more in the non-functional condition than in the functional condition. So if we place objects in a functional way, then we sort of know how they should be oriented and don't explain that as much. So they often assume the interaction partner will know. Second question, how much information do we actually need? Under what circumstances does communication fail? And the answer to that is that listeners are indeed often able to infer the intended meaning, and they draw on background knowledge, they draw on shared situational input, they have common ground with the director, the speaker who explains where the objects go. And communication only fails when the common ground is not sufficient to interpret the given input. And that's the crucial take-home message from this particular study, that speakers in dialogue draw very much on common ground. They assume that the other person will know based on shared background and so on. And if that's not the case, if that doesn't exist between the people, it will actually be really difficult, and then communication will fail. And sometimes it did in our study, but not very often. Okay, so the next question I want to ask is, how do we always share common ground? To what extent do we share common ground? So some examples of spatial reference where this might be a bit difficult. So the second challenge is identifying a perspective in sailing. So coming back to my little model of reference frames, so I've already shown you this intrinsic reference frame with a movement direction towards the locatum. So the movement direction is determined in relation to the relatum. So I could say I'm moving to a position, say the locatum, that is in front of my previous location, where in front of is defined by my view direction. In this case, the speaker is the relatum in an intrinsic reference system. And that means in much simpler language, I am moving forward. Yeah, so I'm moving to a position in front of my previous location defined by my view direction, just means I'm moving forward. Okay, so here's a picture of one of my big hobbies. A little rowing boat. In a rowing boat, people could argue or have a fight about whether I'm rowing forwards or backwards. I don't know if you're used to rowing, but obviously you're sitting the wrong way around in a rowing boat. You don't face in the direction you're actually rowing. And I've in this model picture here, I've called this view direction. So that's the bit on the left. The view direction is opposite to the movement direction, MD. The boat direction is, however, the same as the movement direction. And then if we took that as the basis for perspective, we would say, yes, of course, I'm rowing forward because the boat's looking in that direction. But I, as the rower, I'm looking in the opposite direction. So it's truly ambiguous. With respect to the boat, I'm rowing forwards. With respect to my own view direction, I'm rowing backwards. Okay, fair enough, that's rowing. Sailing is a different matter. So I don't normally sail a yacht, I sail a dinghy. If everything was well aligned and very simple, then we could use this colorful picture here. There are various aspects that could be nicely aligned if that was the case. So we have a wind direction here, we have the view direction. I don't know why this keeps going back. We have port and starboard. We have the direction of the goal, which is GD, and movement direction. And then we have the river direction or tidal direction. And then we have a coastline. Everything is nicely aligned in this picture. In reality, of course, this is very rarely the case. Things are not aligned in sailing, but they go all over the place. So the river might flow in one direction, the wind comes from another, the boat is slightly angled, the view direction is to the side rather than in forward or anything. So lots of different directional bits of information that are totally not aligned with each other at all. The boat is not even moving in the same direction as it's pointing, because the wind and the tide will push it to one side. So it's directionality is really complicated in sailing. You should try it if you haven't. So how do we in sailing refer to a particular movement direction? So I've looked at that and found that sailors typically avoid saying forward at all. They refer to wind, to sails, to starboard and port. They use all sorts of terms, which not all of which are actually technical terms. You know, wind and sails are not technical terms. They are just different things to orient towards. What they also say is, of course, we make some progress roughly in the direction we want to go, but that's not necessarily forward. So what it is, I think, is that sailors have this intuitive knowledge that forward could be based on many things, many perspectives, many directions that come to play during sailing. And the sailors have a high awareness of wind, even when they are not on the water. So that's something they report and experience. So it's quite interesting. So it's a different basis for establishing spatial reference, where you can actually distinguish between sailors and non-sailors in terms of how they refer to space. So possibly a lack of common ground. Okay, challenge 3, finding a reference frame when oriented in a different way. So this is basically the profession of a friend of mine, Kate Lawrence. She does vertical dance, which works by being attached to strong ropes and hanging in the air and standing on walls and things like that. And it's quite beautiful. But once you start thinking about doing things like that, standing on walls, you realize that a lot of our spatial reference is based on the fact that we are normally standing upright on the ground. That's our normal canonical orientation. And we are not used to standing on walls, and we don't basically have any spatial language for that. So we did a little test to find out what people might mean when standing on the wall, which way is up, which way is forward. You can see in these columns in this table here that people don't agree. So when they stand on the wall, up could be the ceiling or the wall or the audience. Forward could be the same in different proportions. And the only thing where people agree in this scenario is that left is stage left. However, you can also distort the direction even more and hang upside down. And then you can even disagree about, again, where up is. It could be the ceiling or the floor, could be either of those. And the forward could be the wall or the audience, in this case, against stage left. But then if you stand sideways on the wall, I didn't have a proper picture for that, I apologize. Then you get all sorts of confusions with left and right. So stage left still plays a role, but not quite such a big role, because other possibilities arise when standing sideways. Basically, our entire system of how we define left and right is completely messed up when we do these funny things with our bodies. Okay, so if we are not oriented properly, we get into trouble when referring to perspective orientation. Fourth challenge I wanted to talk briefly about is agreeing on a reference frame between different languages. And that can be a different kind of challenge again. So this is from two studies that we did with a few colleagues in Spain and elsewhere. Our starting point is the idea that speakers of different languages talk about space in surprisingly different ways. So in some cultures, people would say things like, there's an ant on your southwest leg, something we would never say, I mean, I would never say, and my colleague Anushka, who co-authored this paper, would never say that. So there's an ant on your left leg is what we would say naturally, okay? So people differ in their spatial reference. We looked at Spanish and English and used a scenario where we could distinguish between intrinsic and relative reference frame interpretation. So in this schematic design, you can see that there's an observer who looks at a reference object, which could be, for instance, a table, or it could be David. And then there's a ball, which is an oval here in this picture. So the ball could be to the right of the table from the observer's point of view, or it could be to the right of David from David's point of view. And these are the two possible interpretations of the scene and together with the utterance. So in English, for this particular scenario, we have two constructions. It could be either to the left of David or on David's left. And intuitively, a lot of English native speakers would say, if you say on David's left, then you definitely mean David's left side, and it could never be a relative reference frame, so from a different point of view. If you take a different point of view, a different perspective, and don't mean David's left, then you would say to the left of David, possibly. So basically, intuitively, to the left of David would be used with the relative reference system, preferably, and on David's left with the intrinsic reference system. That's an intuition, which we also tested in our study. But in Spanish, we have only one normal construction. I don't speak Spanish, so I'm not going to pronounce that for you. Which corresponds to the left of David. And then there is another one that is sort of similar to on David's left, but it's not quite the same. So it's more like using a pronoun. It's on its left, right. And it doesn't sound quite as normal in Spanish. So that makes things a bit more complicated. So we had the hypothesis that Spanish speakers choose reference frames differently from English speakers, and that this difference could be related to animacy. So we had 5 different object types, like a vase, which is not animate, not human, and isn't anthropomorphic, so not shaped like a human either. And then the other end of the scale, we have, for instance, a man or a woman. So which has sides, is shaped like a human, is animate, and is human. And then all the different stages in between. So this was our scenario, virtual stimuli. I see a vase, the ball is to the right of the vase. Which one is it, A or B? And on this basis, we could see whether people would be using an intrinsic or a relative reference system. And then we put Samuel there, right, in person. I see Samuel, the ball is to the right of Samuel. Again, is it A or B? Now, in English, the picture is really clear. It's pretty much in agreement with the intuitions that I told you about, that to David's left would be intrinsic and to the left of David would be relative. There are some exceptions which might have to do with animacy, but not a lot. In Spanish, it's very much the case that people prefer the intrinsic reference frame. And only in a situation where there's clearly no indication that there's any sort of humanity, animacy, or even sides there, like a vase, then people would switch to the relative frame in 60% of the cases, but not more than that. So it takes a lot for Spanish speakers to switch from the intrinsic to the relative reference frame. So Spanish speakers choose the intrinsic reference frame more often than English speakers when a non-possessive construction is used. So to the left of David. Only objects that were neither anthropomorphic nor animate triggered the relative frame of reference in Spanish at all. So the notion of inalienable possession is also reflected in Spanish in other ways. So that's the idea that we came up with as an interpretation, that in Spanish, this idea of owning something, like David's left, it belongs to David, nobody can take it away from him. So that's inalienable possession. That matters more in Spanish, also in other linguistic constructions than it does in English. So in that sense, the linguistic repertory affects conceptual choices in the way these constructions are used in Spanish. Next, we looked at Spanish-English bilinguals. So how do people react when they speak both languages? How would they make their choices? So we did the same study again, and as you can see here, even at a glance, the results that we got don't look different between Spanish and English anymore at all. Basically, what happens is, so we've got Spanish on the left, English on the right, and the patterns are very much aligned. So in a sense, bilingual speakers end up somewhere in the middle between Spanish and English conceptual choices as expressed in language. But at a closer look, there are some differences there. So we found that when it comes to syntactic construction, the pattern is similar to the monolingual Spanish data in both English and Spanish. But when it comes to animacy as a factor influencing choice, then the pattern is similar to monolingual English data in both English and Spanish, and we don't find any effects of resonance in this case. So the result is that we have evidence for both L1 to L2 transfer, so people transfer from their first language to their second, but they also lose some aspect of their first language. So that's L1 attrition. So bilinguals actually display a merged system. So they find aspects of both their first language Spanish and their second language English. And our study shows that the exposure to English as a second language affects only those aspects that are important in the first language, Spanish, namely object type, animacy, but not those that are important in the second language, namely syntax in English. So bilinguals might be better able to track input patterns for aspects that are relevant in their first language, but less so for aspects that are relevant in their second language. So these are the studies and the various challenges that I have gone through. Just to summarize those, agreeing on a reference frame requires common ground, because speakers are rarely fully explicit. So we saw that in the dollhouse orientation study. Second, agreeing on a reference frame is difficult when the situational context provides complex and contradictory information, for instance, in sailing. Thirdly, agreeing on a reference frame is difficult when the normal perceptions are distorted, for instance, in a vertical dance. And fourthly, agreeing on a reference frame is difficult when the speakers do not share the same cultural or conceptual or linguistic background. Okay, now I'm ready to turn to smart environments. So envision an environment that is ubiquitous in a house, so an assistant system, for instance, in somebody's home that knows the user and their needs. That does not require a specific position because it doesn't have a particular place at all. It's just everywhere. You can just talk to it. It has no physical presence. So it relies on sensors spread through the house. So that's modern technology. These things exist. You can talk to the user. And now try to imagine a situation where the user wants to find their pills. Where are my pills? Okay, the smart house wants to give an answer. How does it give an answer? Pointing gestures don't really work because there is no physical presence. That's the first thing we would do as humans. Where are my pills? They're over there. Okay, can't do that. Can we use spatial IDs in the system's database? Won't work. The user won't understand them, unfortunately. Can we use the visual representation on a display? We can, but it requires a user adequate display and a situation adaptive database. So it's quite a computational challenge. Can we refer to past actions? For instance, you took them at breakfast. Could, but it requires a lot of word knowledge and invites inferences rather than providing direct answers. So it might come up with further complications. Can we give navigation directions? So describing how to get there to the pills? Well, route directions can easily be misunderstood and they might require tracking where the user is at any point in time. So gradually updating the user's movements, and that comes with huge challenges. So one obvious solution remaining, just describing the object's location. So let's take a look at that. So we looked at different spatial reference types early on in this talk. So I explained briefly that they are schematic and function-based. So under the umbrella is not necessarily a spatial relation, but has to do with other factors as well. That's not a system's strength because it doesn't have all that background knowledge required for that sort of thing. Then we could look at topological terms like in and on. They are extremely context dependent. They presuppose proximity notions and topological reasoning. There's a lot of research on that showing all sorts of complications, and they don't always apply or are not always sufficient to describe an object's location anyway. Then path-related terms like along, across, and so on. They are quite complicated if you look at them closely. They come with geometrical constraints. You have to make a lot of inferences to interpret them. Then we have distance-related terms, near or far. They are quite intuitive for humans, but not necessarily so for systems because they come with issues concerning granularity. At what level is it near or far? How much detail do we assume? They're very vague as well. Okay, so again, let's turn to projective terms. Okay, they are relatively context and function-free. Models exist, so there's a lot of work that has already gone into them. But of course, all these complications I talked about earlier will now arise. For instance, that agreeing on a reference frame requires common ground. Well, a smart environment does not share a lot of specific common ground with the human speaker. Everything needs to be implemented or machine learned. So quite a big challenge. Secondly, agreeing on a reference frame is difficult when the situation, a complex context provides complex and contradictory information. A household context can be surprisingly complex when there is no previous common ground. So we find household context very easy because we've grown up in them, we know all about them, but a system doesn't share this common ground, so everything needs to be, again, implemented. Thirdly, agreeing on a reference frame is difficult when the normal perceptions are distorted. So thinking of vertical dance. the perception of an automatic as assistance system is very different from that of a human. If there's not even the physical body with an orientation, then it's bound to be extremely different. So perceptions will be distorted. And fourthly, agreeing on the reference frame is difficult when the speakers do not share the same cultural or conceptual or linguistic background. So in a sense, you could say that smart environments and humans, or any automatic system and humans, speak very different languages because they draw on different conceptual systems. They think differently. Okay, so before I close, I wanted to propose a possible solution for this dilemma. So thinking back about how we actually refer to object orientation. So there might be the possibility of establishing orientation information by reference to relate term, by reference to projective terms, and by using absolute reference systems. The chair's back points north. Okay, so pointing north is something that we don't necessarily use in indoor spaces in our cultures, but other cultures do. Some people know where north is all the time. So it's possible to say there's an ant on your southwest leg in some cultures. So it's humanly possible to use these cardinal directions all of the time. So if we thought of that as a solution for an indoor scenario with a smart environment, I wouldn't suggest to actually use compass terms because we just don't have this knowledge or awareness indoors. I don't know if you know at this moment where north is. I don't. Well, I know my own environment. I know roughly where north is, but normally I wouldn't. But we can use something similar. So we could agree on a directional system that does work indoors. So for instance, we could give walls a color or just put some colorful pointers on the different walls. So in that case, we could then refer to the green wall or next to the blue wall, on the table at the red wall, between the trash can and the yellow wall. So that gives us a perspective and an orientation that is always there, that is like a cardinal direction, like a compass direction, and it's directly visible for us in the environment. It would require a bit of practice, but it does speak to humans' conceptual and linguistic strengths. And it's compatible with the way systems think because it can be directly, easily implemented. And then both the user and the human, the human and the system could refer to these different directions systematically and consistently. So that's it from me. And I think we have about 10 minutes left for discussion. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about this possible solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thora. Questions? Maybe we can change the view to gallery. Can I do gallery here?
I'll start things off, Paulo.
Right. Yep.
Thank you, Thora. There's a whole idea of entrenchment and degrees of metaphor with, for example, the anthropomorphism. So a house has sort of a front facade with window-like eyes and the front door, and we talk about front door, front windows, front room. So is that what's happening there?
Yeah, we do assign front sides to buildings on the basis of how we use them, but they can be confused. And the biggest problem with that is that that doesn't automatically mean that we also have a left and a right side. So if we just use the front side of a building, we have one side clearly defined, possibly the opposite side by contrast, but left and right would still be a problem for an automatic system if you think about it that way.
Bob.
Thora, I have a question from a colleague who unfortunately had to leave a little bit earlier. He's got two questions, but I think I think his first question had to do with different cultures, and I think you touched on that a little bit. So I'll just summarize his second questions and make my own assumptions about it as well. He said that, so with the incomplete instructions for the dollhouse task, so there were a lot of, even though there were a lot of incomplete instructions, the task was pretty much completed with very few mistakes. And so he says, I have a feeling people from different cultural backgrounds would take these incomplete instructions very differently. So basically, I think he's saying that the grounding is culturally specific. And so from culture to culture, from language to language, what you assume as kind of given is going to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, very good observation. Yeah, this study should be redone with different cultures. Absolutely.
And
especially if people come from cultures where a house would actually be furnished in a very different way. So that's, you know, if houses are furnished similarly, then I think it wouldn't matter quite as much, because the common ground would be similar for that particular scenario. But of course, there are cultures where houses do look different, and then people would be pretty much at a loss as to where to put things intuitively. Yeah.
And the first question was sort of had to do with, so you did this, your experiment in German, and they were all German speakers.
Yes.
How would it work if you had two speakers from, you know, different cultures or different languages? How would that task work?
Yeah, exactly. So people with different cultural background would bring in different background assumptions. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, the language barrier itself. So as I showed in the Spanish-English study, even interpreting an utterance or a spatial reference in a new language, even if you're a perfectly fluent speaker in the second language, you might still be interpreting the reference frame differently without even noticing that you're doing it differently than the native speakers, because these differences are really subtle. And then misunderstandings can arise, and people don't even understand why, because they speak a language fluently, but some aspect of the interpretation of their first language comes through, and then objects would be placed differently. Yes.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, with like when you're experimenting on people that speak two different languages, are you maybe like when you're talking about English and Spanish and how it changes people's reference frames, do you get people to speak or listen to Spanish for a few minutes before? And like, have you tried that with people?
Or priming towards a particular language, you mean?
Yeah, well, I speak English and Spanish, and I think that my reference frame would change if I just spoke Spanish for a few minutes. You know, if I was forced, because then I would start to think in Spanish if I just have to do it for a little while.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Like I think that, yeah, thinking in a different, like, you know, like when I became fluent in Spanish was when I could actually think in Spanish. I didn't have to, you know, switch back and forward.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you'd tried that. Like, you're talking about doing experiments on bilingual people, but I'm wondering if you've tried.
We thought that location, whether they are in an English-speaking context or in a Spanish-speaking context, would matter, but we found that it didn't. But right. You might be right that just what happens in the previous half hour would have an influence on how much a person speaks or thinks in a particular language, and that might affect the associated concepts to some extent. Yeah, but it remains to be tested. Absolutely, it's an interesting thought. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mohammed online's got his hand up.
I think it's the mouse. I think we have time for a final question. Oh, Jenny.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you would have any comment about the way that people learn spatial referencing. So for example, with a system like sailing or pilots, there's already a fairly established kind of system of communicating that's been developed over a long time that people have to learn to adopt, and how that might be different from, for example, if you're learning how to do vertical dance, you have to then develop a new one and kind of negotiate the right level of abstraction to be able to effectively communicate, if what you might know about those processes.
So learning to communicate in a context like vertical dance.
Yeah, and how that might be different, for example, so someone who's learning sailing or learning piloting skills is coming into an established system.
Yes.
And learning to adopt that.
Ah, yes, I get you. Okay, yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly the experience that that people share. That, you know, in sailing, people learn the concepts along with the skill, and then along with the concepts comes the language, and then it just becomes second nature to not use left and right and not use forward, but just refer to the wind and the sails. That's just, you know, you pick that up as you go, because that's what sailors do. Whereas with vertical dance, Kate Lawrence, who teaches that, has really made that experience that it is actually really difficult to communicate sometimes, just because people interpret these terms in so different ways. So the most stable system really is to refer to stage left, stage right, because that audience and wall to really refer to these stable directions. And that's actually quite similar to what I've proposed at the end of my talk, that if otherwise reference fails, then the safest, most stable system that we can fall back to is something like cardinal directions. So clear directions that are always there, stable, don't change, no matter how much you turn and twist, and no matter what else fails. But yeah, first of all, you have to establish these directions, and then you can use them. So yeah, no, it's a good point you make. So thank you for that. So there's really a difference between something that has been long established over thousands of years, like sailing, and something that has only just been invented and doesn't have a language to come with it. Good point.
Well, unfortunately, we have to finish the discussion here for starting the next keynote speech. So let's thank Thora once more. Thank you very much.